Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar that's sponsored by the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Patrick Griffin. I'm the Madden Hennebrey Professor of History, and I also direct the Keough-Naughton Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today. His name is Muiris MacCarthaigh. Muiris is Senior Lecturer of Politics and Public Administration at Queen's University in Belfast, and he's also the past president of the Political Studies Association of Ireland. Muiris was educated at Trinity College Dublin, then at UCD, where he did his graduate work. Since then, his primary areas of focus have been Irish government and politics, public administration, public policy, and public sector reform. His most recent book's entitled Public Sector Reform in Ireland, Countering Crisis. It's a deep dive and also a bird's eye view of really the unprecedented reform that followed the Irish economic crisis of 2008. Muiris is also involved in a number of intriguing long-term projects. One, an international consortium, is entitled International Public Policy Observatory. He works with a number of colleagues at universities around the world that provide policymakers with access to resources, evidence, and analysis of global policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, something that's all too topical. He's also co-investigator of a project entitled Apologies, Abuses, and Dealing with the Past. This project explores apologies linked to the harms arising from conflict in Ireland, institutional child abuse, and the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis. Alas, Muiris and his colleagues in this have been all too busy as of late. And this gets us to today, the focus of today's talk. Muiris is going to walk us through the financial crisis, but also the ways that the Irish used and made use of apologies. His talk is entitled Accounting for the 2008 Irish Economic Crisis, the Role of Public Apologies. Muiris, welcome. It's great to see you. Before you kick it off and get started, let me just one housekeeping item. You will undoubtedly have questions. We welcome these questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen the Q&A function. If I have to walk you through this by now, God knows you probably know this much better than I do, but just tap your question into the Q&A, and when Muiris finishes his presentation, we'd be delighted to handle as many as we possibly can. And with that, I turn it over to Muiris.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. Good afternoon from a very surprisingly balmy Belfast, everybody. The wonders of modern technology. I know it's the morning time for you there, but I'm really, really delighted. It's a huge honor to be able to speak with you today. And I'm not just saying that because it's some sort of tradition to say it, but it must be, I was just thinking 18 years, I think, since I was in Indiana for my one and only visit to Notre Dame, and I just loved it. I thought it was an extraordinary place. So one day, hopefully, I'll be back. But it's I'm really very pleased to be able to speak to you today, and I think hopefully you'll find this interesting. And as Patrick says, I look forward to the questions. But and just to finish on the thank yous, I mean, thank you very much to the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies for inviting me, to Patrick, and also to Mary, who's just been absolutely extraordinary in terms of our marketing. I've given several presentations at Queen's, and none of them has got the internal profile that this has. So I don't know what her magic trick is, but I must learn it. And thank you also to Tim, who's in the background managing the IT side of things. Now, I am going to share my screen, and I think, Patrick, you can give me the nod or vocally say if everything looks good there, and hopefully that's okay. Excellent. Okay, well, there's the title, as Patrick has announced on the screen. So, Accounting for the 2008 Irish Economic Crisis, the Role of Public Apologies. So just by way of context, I mean, and I'll speak about the project which Patrick mentioned I'm interested in, and I never really thought about apologies as a concept or as a subject of inquiry until a couple of years ago when I was asked to be involved in this project. But it's a huge topic in several disciplines, particularly in international relations and particularly in law. And the more certainly I and the rest of the team read into it, you discover that we are, whether you're aware of this or not, we're very much living in this age of apologies where governments and public organizations, but also many private organizations seek to, open the books and account for the past. And encompassing this, I mean, I'm thinking of things here like decolonialism and people questioning about, statues in public places and all of these issues, the Me Too movement, for example. But the primary focus, certainly in political science, has been interstate apologies. Former colonizers apologizing to the states that they colonized, strong states apologizing to weaker states, and so on, and trying some type of a turn towards what's called like international moralism. So a move away from the real politic of the strong states win and so on. Now some people say it's apology mania. There's so many apologies, it's hard to keep up with what's going on. And I'm for good or ill, Justin Trudeau, who's the image there in the top right, has developed quite a name for apologies. He's apologized to everybody, to the Indigenous Canadian population. He's apologized to women. He's apologized to the LGBT community. And questions over, are these crocodile tears? Are these real tears? And so on. Possibly the second image there you'll see, though, is one of the most famous apologies in the world. And it's possibly more famous for the fact that nothing was said. And it's the West German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, in 1958, I think it was, kneeling at a monument to the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And he just went and knelt and didn't say anything and sat there for a minute. And this is seen as just powerful, powerful symbolism. And it's something I'll return to in the presentation. The performance of an apology is quite a big issue. And the bottom image there is Australia. Kevin Rudd, Prime Minister, introduced a National Sorry Day in Australia. So every year there is a sort of what's called the National Sorry Day in Australia for the Aboriginal community who were very badly treated by those that arrived in Australia and colonized Australia. And so that's an ongoing issue there. But just in terms of the academic examination of apologies, suffice it to say, there's a lot of the social science literatures would settle on two broad two interpretations of apologies. And the first one is by Tavukas, and it's based on this idea of an apology. Originally it was based on the idea of an apology as a defense, like trying to defend your actions. But it's very much today seen as expressing remorse, acknowledging a harm or pain or maltreatment, and expressing remorse and restoration. So it's this idea of trying to return a social harmony. A harm has been done and we want to restore the equilibrium, and the apology restores the equilibrium. And then there is this other approach which is quite common in corporate reputation, so PR companies and so on. And this is has its origins in work by Goffman, who says, well, the idea of the apology is that organizations or individuals have two parts, the good part and the bad part. And the bad part sometimes does bad things, and the good part has to come along and say, sorry about that, that was the bad part, that wasn't the whole entity, it wasn't me, I didn't mean that, or it wasn't the organization, and we're going to address that. We needn't dwell on this too much, but suffice it to say there are two kind of approaches to the idea of how you might conceptualize an apology. But the Tavukas one is by far the most popular. But in both cases, and one of the interesting things about apology is, that if I apologize to Patrick for something, Patrick has to accept that. There's this idea of it's incomplete, and apology is incomplete unless Patrick says, well, I hear you and I acknowledge you, and I accept that, and so on. And that's something we'll return to. And so there's broad agreement across the literature about an apology being it's a dialectic. I can't be on my own. Like Patrick has to know what I'm apologizing for, So nothing so far, Patrick, as far as I know. So I came to my own background is very much like my PhD was on the issue of political accountability, and I've always been interested in this idea of like how does one provide an account, and who provides the account and where, and so on. And a lot of political science literature is very much premised on this idea that we live in this idea of blame avoidance or blame dodging. Politicians, being a good politician equals being able to divert. When something goes wrong, you can pass the buck. You can say, oh, it was the bureaucrat's fault, or it was somebody else's fault, or it was some organization did something wrong. So a lot of there's a lot of literature now that tries to understand the design of government, even this idea of separation of powers, which is very familiar in the American sense, of course, but it's designed not just to avoid the conglomeration of power in one institution, which we generally see as a bad idea, but it's also a way to dissipate blame. Okay, so this is a novel way to think about government. It's just one big blame avoidance system. So people have written about this. Johan Olsen, most famously, and he says here, that there's an obsession with accountability nowadays. Everybody wants accountability. He says, in some respects, there's nearly too much. When I would do a lot of work with public servants who say, well, I spend most of my time being accountable for what I do, for the fear of not being able to be accountable. But of course, the public will always say, well, there's not enough accountability in public life. So there's these different worldviews about accountability. And the connection to apologies is that an apology is the opposite of blame avoidance. Apology is acknowledgement, it's blame acceptance. And I became very interested in this issue of if on the one hand we have big problems of political accountability in Ireland, as in many democracies around the world, and yet we're also living in this era, we're being told of blame acceptance. And how can we understand the two? How do the two sit together? I ignore that bullet point there about reputational enhancement. It basically means that sometimes people over-apologize or are overly accountable in order to show just how good they are to enhance their reputation. Now, apologies, as I've said, internationally, we talk about apology mania, the era of apologies, but once you start looking, and I guarantee you after this presentation today, not claiming any greatness on my part, but once you start looking, you'll start seeing apologies in areas you possibly never noticed before. And these are just a couple of newspaper clippings, virtual or clippings I got online of things in the last number of years in Ireland. So you have various Taoiseach making apologies for various things. So it's quite common, these apologies. The first one on the top left there, as you can see it, patient group meets Taoiseach over cervical check apology, is quite interesting because as part of that apology, Lee Varadkar and Taoiseach said, well, sorry for failings in the health system. And people in the health system said, oh, hang on, we didn't do anything wrong. It was somebody else did something wrong, which is something I'll return to about the danger of basically managing external and internal constituencies when making an apology. So apologies are, omnipresence may be a bit strong, but they're very present in Ireland today for historical wrongs. And this brings us to the project I'm working on, which Patrick mentioned, and it's titled Apologies, Abuses and Dealing with the Past. And basically it's funded by the British Economic and Social Research Council. So using the island of Ireland, so it's a cross-border project, and it takes 3 what we call cases or sites of analysis. So there's apologies for the troubles in effect, primarily, but not solely associated with paramilitary violence, but also state violence, institutional child abuse. And the piece that I was sort of brought on board where I ever became involved in this apologies work is on the Irish economic crisis of 2008, which was really seismic, certainly a big defining moment in my lifetime. Before coronavirus, of course, for defining for all of us. And these are some of the themes we're looking at. And you can see just by the bullet points there, how apologies, the reach it gives you across so many, I guess, variables in how we study and examine society. Apologies, the law, truth, choreography, legitimacy, leadership, reconciliation, national imagination. And the piece I was very interested in was this idea of accountability. Apologies as a form of delivering accountability. When people say that there's none. Okay, what have we done? I won't stay too long in this. Suffice to say, we did a big literature review across a variety of disciplinary areas. We did a fairly innovative cross-border survey, over 1,007 respondents, and I'll show you some of the results of that. We've held, this pre-pandemic, of course, is from 2017 onwards, a variety of focus groups with victims. Very tricky, I have to say, not one you have to be very careful with, issues of re-traumatization and so on that come up here. We also did focus group with victims, focus groups with people sort of randomly selected from the general population across the island in a number of locations, and then a large number of interviews with victims and apologizers in the 3 sites of analysis. Again, some very tricky cases there, which you'd expect when dealing with the troubles, violence from the troubles, and also institutional child abuse. But actually, as I discovered, some harrowing stories and people crying, telling their stories of banking crisis as well. So one not to be underestimated at all, the significance of it. So, well, what did we find? I'll just give you some highlight pictures here. And here's the question. So, and of course, terms and conditions apply to all of these things, but just suffice it to say 1,000 people weighted according to population size on both sides of the border, and we got 1,007 responses. We said, well, do you see yourself as a person who apologizes easily? And so about, we have 60% of people said, yeah, I do. If you add in another 20% there, so what, 3 in every 5 people say, yes, I do. Another one says, yeah, I think so. And then some people say, no, I don't apologize very easily. But going back to my original point, saying that, if I apologize to Patrick has to forgive me and accept it. Forgiveness is a little harder. And this came up quite a lot, this concept of, well, I'll forgive, but I won't forget, and so on. Or sorry, no, I'll accept an apology, but I won't ever fully forget or forgive, or things like this. So you're looking there, it's slightly less, maybe about 50% of people saying, yes, I forgive kind of easily. But close on 20%, or sorry, nearly a quarter saying no, I don't forgive very easily. Now this is all context dependent. Of course, people have something in their mind, maybe when they're asked that sort of question. And you can see the text there that women are slightly more likely to both apologize and forgive, but no major statistical difference. And gender is a very big issue in apology studies. There's a general belief that people believe an apology more from a woman, because societally we're meant to believe women are more empathetic and so on, than from a man. And quite often you'll get like large corporations putting out a female representative rather than a male representative to make an apology, depending on the context. Okay, so we said, well, look, we explained we've 3 cases we're looking at here. Do you think apologies are important for dealing with institutional abuse, the banking crisis, and the Troubles? And overwhelmingly, people say yes, absolutely. Some variety there. You can see there for the institutional abuse, apologies are really, really high. Whereas when it comes to the Troubles, it's 30% of people strongly agreeing. So it's not to be ignored, the sort of the differences between the cases here, and it's something that we explored a bit in the focus groups. That in some cases apologies were all that people wanted, an apology, a recognition, whereas in others they were like, no, I don't want an apology. I want compensation, something else. But generally speaking, people believe apologies are important for these 3 cases. And here's just some, I won't read them out because you will read quicker than I can speak, but it'll give you just some idea there. I mean, the locations, Dublin, Fermanagh, across the border, Galway, out the west of Ireland. And you can see the types of responses we're getting for people. So the middle person there, talking about the trouble, saying, look, I can't let it go. I can't forgive. I can't accept an apology. Or how people make distinctions between the sites of analysis, because the church is this emotional, spiritual thing, whereas the banks, they're just temporal institutions, as it were. So, big variety of opinions and views and perspectives on apologies and forgiveness. So then we get into the interesting area of saying, well, do you know of any apologies? Okay, are there any apologies you're familiar with? And here we broke down the 3 sites of analysis by the various actors involved. So you can see there for the Troubles, Republicans, Loyalists, British State, Irish State. For the institutional abuse, Catholic Church, Irish State, Northern Irish State, individual priests, and then for the banking. And, interestingly, and the theme that kept coming up is really very low recognition of apologies in respect to the banking sector, the one I was looking at. But the 2 sort of peaks there, one in terms of the British state, and therefore on the Troubles, and then the Irish state and the church in respect of institutional abuse. And a lot of that seems to be related to, on the one hand, there was a very famous apology by then Taoiseach Enda Kenny a number of years back, where he apologised for the Magdalen laundries. And this came up quite a lot in the focus groups. Why did it come up? It's because he broke down in the Dáil, in the Parliament, and people remember this. So now I will say that one focus group member said it was the greatest act of political theatre he'd ever saw, so just did not believe him. But by and large, people thought it was very emotional. He cried, he meant it, and it was sincere. Okay, and again, a big issue in apology research is the sincerity or authenticity, and people remember that, and I imagine that's what the survey respondents were thinking about as well. But people remember the actual delivery of the performance in the Dáil, and the fact he stalled and he cried when he delivered. And the other one, you remember I just said a minute ago there about the British state comes up quite 30% there. People remember this one. Now, this is one of the most famous apologies in Ireland, and it's the Bloody Sunday apology. And the reason this is remembered, again, just think of the performance and the delivery. It was delivered in Westminster, in the House of Commons, by David Cameron, but it was delivered sort of in real time on a large screen in the Guildhall Square in Derry, where those who were killed by the parachute regiment in 1972, their family were there on the very spot. So huge emotional and symbolic significance being attached to this. And it's incredible how many people remember it. It's one of the apologies we're looking at in great detail, because there was a huge amount of choreography and diplomacy behind the scenes about what exactly David Cameron was going to say. Although apparently he put a line through what the civil servants had said and did his own thing, but that's still, there's differing views on that. But where the apology was given, to whom it was given, and so on. But people really remember this, and it came up in focus groups a lot, where you say, do you remember any apologies about anything at all? And people said, well, what was that one in Derry in the Guildhall Square? And this was the Bloody Sunday apology a number of years back. So it was two of the more famous ones, Enda Kenny and more so the Bloody Sunday apology. So this brings us to the case study, my focus. As I said to you, this is one of the sites of analysis. And for those of you on the call, maybe too young to remember or who are trying to forget this, I mean, it was really an extraordinary time in Ireland. I remember it very, very well. My daughter, who's now 12, obviously, was just born a few weeks before sort of the Irish economy and world all fell apart. So it was a very, very strange time. It was, in effect, a huge collapse in the Irish. I mean, look, there's a long story actually going all the way back to the subprime mortgage debacle in Florida, and the sort of the poison coming from the United States housing market spreading across interbank trading across the world, and washed up in Ireland. And Irish banks had basically loaned out way too much money, which they were never going to see back. And in the end, what happened was the Irish government, for fear that there literally wasn't going to be cash in the ATM machines the next day, because the banks just didn't have enough money in reserve to cover the loans they'd given out. The Irish state sort of guaranteed all the liabilities, sort of guaranteed the banking system in effect. So this was unprecedented, and they were guaranteeing the banking system without knowing at all how much debt was in those banks. And it was enormous. It was like 380 or 60 something billion. I mean, massive, unbelievable. Now, they didn't have to pay all that back at all, but it was an extraordinary step for an Irish government to take. It resulted 2 years of sort of cutbacks and what's generically known as years of austerity, which went on for several years, but the first 2 years were very difficult, to the point where no bond market, or nobody on the international bond market, would loan money to the Irish government. The only people Ireland could get money from to sort of keep going as a viable entity was from the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission, also known as the Troika. And that was there, you see a very famous picture of the IMF team walking to government buildings. And on the very left, they have AJ Chopra, who became known as the Chopper, became a household name. And there's obviously somebody begging, I think it's meant to symbolize Ireland, as well as the whole team walked by there. And I'll come back to this, but it was several years later, it took quite some time to have an official parliamentary inquiry into what the hell happened within the banking system. And that brought the people who were in charge of the banks at the time and their successors in for questioning. And that's a picture there, that banking inquiry. But yeah, as I say, I don't need to go over it all. We just don't have time, but it was just extraordinary. Obviously in the United States, Bear Stearns, wasn't it, fell or was let go. The Irish government didn't do that. It kind of sort of tried to keep the banks going. It didn't let some fall, and maybe people say it should have. It should have just let, these are private institutions. The debts of these private institutions were guaranteed at the stroke of a pen, and suddenly it was public debt. So every taxpayer in Ireland was suddenly, on the hook for the liabilities of this really poor lending practices by Irish banks over several years. Most infamously at all, the now defunct Anglo-Irish Bank. About half of the bank bailout, which was about 64 billion in the end, approximately half of that was to one bank alone, Anglo-Irish Bank, who was the darling of the private sector in the early 2000s for just handing out money hand over fist, completely poorly regulated, and suddenly that bank's liabilities were suddenly the Irish state, i.e. the Irish taxpayers' liabilities. It's still controversial to this day. I mean, it is a different name now, but the cost of that money borrowed to bail out the banks still accounts for about €1 billion a year. So the Irish budget, like the annual cost, is about 60 billion, the budget a bit more. So 1 billion of that is paying still to this day, and will be for several years, for the bank bailout. I'm giving rounded figures here, obviously. And one of these images was used, I think, for by Mary to promote this seminar that I'm presenting. The one on the top right is interesting. Ballyhay says no to bondholder bailout. That group still meets. As far as I'm aware, we went and interviewed them. So it's a small community in North Cork called Ballyhay, and once a month, on the first Sunday of every month, the people come out and march. And you might say, well, what's the point? There's like 15 people there, but actually tremendous dignity about it, and tremendously huge sincerity about just a fundamental belief that it was wrong that the Irish state sort of took on the liabilities of these banks and sort of bailed out the banks, and that taxpayers were on the hook for it. But there were protests. There were wide. There's often this thing of there was no protests in Ireland just because there was no violent scenes, like in Greece, where there was nights and nights of riots. But there were certainly protests. There was the Reclaim the Streets on the bottom right-hand picture there, as has happened in Spain as well at that time. And that's just, I mean, basically the blue figure shows, the day-to-day sort of cash flow of the Irish state, for want of a better term. It just went through the floor. The amount of money coming in just was really took a huge hit, and the cost of running the state actually continued up until 2009. So the Irish government had to borrow more and more till it got to like 120%, which is extremely dangerous territory. You're in the zone then for you're literally borrowing to pay off the interest on what you've already borrowed. But it came back down under control till, of course, the pandemic came along. But it had huge political ramifications. I'm coming back to apologies now in a minute, but it had huge political ramifications. If you look in 2008, so the night of when the Irish government sort of gave the guarantee and said, we will cover the liabilities of all the banks, from that moment on, you can see the green line. That was the then government, Fianna Fáil Green Party. They just sort of plummeted to the point where in the subsequent, what's called the earthquake election of 2011, Fianna Fáil, like one of the world's most successful political parties in terms of how often they've been in power over their history, was nearly wiped out. I mean, it really suffered. It went from 77 to 20 seats and was lucky to get some of those 20. In contrast, Fine Gael and Labour, so the traditional number 2 and 3 parties in the Irish party system, their stock rose very quickly, and they formed this government in 2011. You can see there over on the right, with a couple of months after the Troika loan programme began, and they formed a government with the largest ever majority. The red line is a very interesting story because there has been a huge fragmentation of the Irish party system. There's a lot of small parties, a lot of independents. Sinn Féin is the big story. It's now in the polls, it's the largest, the party with the largest individual support according to polls. But also the Irish Parliament has the largest number of independents in it of any parliament in Europe. So real fragmentation of the old, it was really, up until maybe 20 years ago, you really just had 3, possibly 4 parties in the Dáil, or really dominating the seating in the Dáil, but it's much more fragmented now. Very, very hard for governments to form a majority. Single party government's probably gone forever. And this is in effect the same. This is every election since 1922. And you can see there traditionally Fianna Fáil in pink, always top dog. After 2011, it really sank down, has made something of a comeback. Fine Gael for a while was first largest party in the history of the state for the first time. Labour has suffered, is still in a bit of trouble, and the big rise of Sinn Féin since 1997. So those of you who study anything out of Irish politics will be aware of this. But it all goes back to this crisis. I mean, the effects of this in the political system are still working their way through is the point I want to make. So as part of the kind of catharsis of this disaster in 2008, there was a parliamentary inquiry. It took a long time to set up because there was a big discussion about, the parliamentary committee couldn't act like a court, had to be very careful with the questions asked. Some people say it was overly cautious, but those involved said, look, we had to be, because you had all sorts of legal representation and the potential of the inquiry not proceeding if court cases would have been taken. But what was interesting about it was that, as I mentioned, the bankers were invited as witnesses. And this man here, Dermot Gleeson, he did give a very famous apology, which I've put up here in pretty soon after the 2008 crisis. It was the first AGM of Allied Irish Banks, which effectively was nationalised by the Irish state. It wasn't as bad as Anglo-Irish Bank, but Allied Irish Bank, unfortunately they're both AIB, but Allied Irish Bank is quite an old bank, and he was the chairman, and he did make an apology. That AGM was famous because somebody stood up and threw eggs at him, missed him, but it was I remember it being on the news. A lot of pensioners, their pensions were wiped out. They had shares in Allied Irish Banks, and they were gone. So he did make an apology, and he came back to the inquiry, and he renewed us there. You can see I've sort of highlighted there. I want to express my sincere regret and to renew the apology. Now, those of you who are, you'll already be tuning in. Well, what's the difference between an expression of regret? So again, sorry to pick on you, Patrick. I might say, well, Patrick, I regret what happened, is very different from saying I'm sorry about what happened. They're two different things. But there we have, so this is verbatim what was said in 2009 and then what he did. And then we have a couple of other bankers. I don't remember all of their names here, but again, I'm sorry for all the text on the screen. I don't quite like doing this, but you can see the different ways in which the term apology is being used. I should say, maybe at this point it's useful to say in corporate communications literature, where sort of organizational reputation is a big thing, apology is really the last thing you do, okay? You deny, you downplay the significance of the harm. There is actually, I've seen these, I interviewed a few people from PR companies, and they say, look, there's all these things you do, and it's only at the very end, there's no other way out of it. You have to sort of fess up and say, no, look, I apologize. It's primarily about legal liability. It's primarily about money. If you apologize, you're acknowledging it was your fault, and you have to compensate and so on. But you could see there the different ways in which apologies are being delivered. But the point I want to make is that there were some, to be fair to Dermot Gleeson, a very clever man, a former Attorney General to the Irish government. And so there was various forms of apologies given. But in our survey, which was after this inquiry, we said, well, are you aware of any apologies from individual bankers? No, pretty much, bar a few people who probably said yes, maybe an error, or maybe, by and large, people did not hear them. Okay, so there's a real difficulty for banks generally, that you could say, well, apologies, okay, maybe some of them were a bit mealy-mouthed, or they were very carefully worded or scripted, but nobody remembers them in the way they remember Enda Kenny or David Cameron and so on. And that's, again, this chart here, have these groups adequately apologized? Well, yeah, I believe, the IRA have, or loyalist paramilitary groups have, or I believe the Catholic Church has, or the Irish state. Banks, no, by and large. So people just don't, for whatever reason, have a real trust issue with banks. And here are just some quotes that came up for people. Now, since we did the survey, there was another scandal in the banks, what was called a tracker mortgage scandal, where it turns out people were being overcharged on their mortgage by banks. So again, a big reputational hit, and we were interviewing people a little bit in that context as well. So these are things. Now, again, just like any of you who are students, as a method, you got to be careful with interviews. I'm not saying that this is fully representative of the country. You're inviting people into a room, and they're expressing personal opinions. But certainly a lot of anger towards banks. And I've just put up the logo there of the Irish Banking Culture Board a couple of years ago. This is an primarily industry-funded entity called the Irish Banking Culture Board, because there's a recognition that a belief that banks needed an overhaul, that their reputation, that their actions the only way you can address it is through a serious culture change, okay, that the pursuit of profit and so on had led to this disaster in 2008. The pursuit of quick profit, massive profits. I think there was a great line where they said it took Bank of Ireland like 200 and something years to make its first £1 billion profit, and then just another 8 years to make another £2 billion profit. Just this pressure to make massive amounts of money. So we need this culture change. So that's an organization that's up and running. But people believe there should be more apologies. You can see here the figures are pretty much across the board between the blue and the orange there when you add it up. People want more apologies. Very few saying, well, in fact, you'll see, you hear that it's only coming across as 10% there, but that's something you'd often hear. Obviously, I live in Belfast, people saying the troubles, I was just got to move on, there's just, you're picking at the scab and so on by constantly going back and seeking justice or seeking court cases and so on. It's a very live issue at the moment. And it raises these questions. If you're looking for more apologies, well, who should apologize? And there's an interesting contrast here in respect of the church, but it's actually a more fundamental, it's a very common issue in any organization. So should it be the head of the bank, or should it be the local bank manager who gave you the money? In this case here, should it be the Pope who did apologize? And yet somebody else remembered, no, it was actually somebody further down the hierarchy. It was an ordinary priest or monk who did this kind of penitential work. But this is true more generally in most organization settings. Like who gives the apology? At what level in the organization is it most appropriately and most meaningfully delivered? There are alternatives, of course. You can see here some of the options we said to people. Well, what would you like to see happen? Apologies is over on the very right. These are public apologies now, not private apologies. Ensuring non-repetition is kind of an obvious one. People say, we never want to see it happen again. But there's still quite a demand there. Like, look, in terms of banking, people still want to see prosecutions. What are the other ones? There, compensation, 50% of people around institutional abuse and banking. Less so for the troubles. I mean, that doesn't really surprise me, that quite often people, who lost a loved one or a family member, family members tend to be loved ones, don't they? Are not really interested in compensation, and often it's just trying to find out what happened. They want knowledge, information, acknowledgement. So these are some of the things we're looking at. And I'll just conclude on this slide. I think I'm pretty much on time here. So, apologies are rarely rejected for being unwarranted or being seen as inappropriate. You can't go too far wrong with giving an apology. If I just apologize to Patrick, he's not going to think badly of me. He might be wondering what did he do, but he won't think badly of me, hopefully, for it. It's more a case that when they're perceived to be insincere or inadequate, that an apology is undermined to the point where it's kind of meaningless. But what seems to be what's coming through from our findings is that if there was a formula around an apology, here are some of the ingredients that you'd want to include in it. First of all, you need to engage with those who are harmed. So I can't just come out and say, I'd like to apologize for what I did to that community. That you have to sort of ask that community, like, what would make an apology meaningful to you? What do you need to hear so you can move on? There's also, I mentioned at the very start, the Leave Riker apology with the health system. And you must be careful in any organization if you can come out and say, well, I'm very sorry for the terrible job we did in our organization. And the staff say, excuse me, sorry, we worked really hard. We were told to do this particular thing. Turned out it was illegal, but we were told to do it. I'm just making a hypothetical example here. And you're going out and apologizing and saying, oh, the people who work in the company, it's their fault. Well, you've got a problem, okay? So people outside of it might say, oh, well, there you go, we know whose fault it is now. But the people inside the organization might say, you've completely undermined us. So an apology is a very difficult thing. And on either the three sides of analysis, you've got your internal constituencies to manage as well. Recognition is a very important part of apology. I apologize for the thing. I recognize specifically what the thing is. And I admit that I am at fault, or my organization is at fault. I've already mentioned this. Who apologizes, at what time, timing, dates and so on can be significant. Where, the location, how, the format. Is it on a screen? Is it in person? Is it on a stage? How is the apology given? And of course, follow through, that it's not just words. People always want to see action taken afterwards. And that's the link to the project if you're interested in this. And they're working on a paper on this at the moment. I meant to sort of try to do the final revisions and get it submitted this week, but didn't. So, but I'll hopefully get it out. Hopefully it'll get through review and get published at some stage. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. And I'll hand back to you, Patrick. Is that okay?
Oh, that's great. That's great, Muiris. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you also, because using me as a straw man or a prop for your apologies was great, because that's quite a role reversal for me. Usually I'm the one offering regret or repenting for something I did. So thank you for that. It makes my day. I have a bag of questions. Unfortunately, we have some questions coming in. Two of them, by the way, have stolen my thunder, the sorts of things I wanted to ask you, but they're great questions. So let's go right to them. First is by Colin Barr, who of course is here with us this year and next year at the Keough-Naughton Institute. And Colin asked this: given the long-standing and quite structured tradition of apology in certain East Asian cultures, and in particular Japan, is it your sense that those traditions are too culturally particular to serve as a useful basis for research into what seems to be a more dynamic or developing Western culture of apology? And so its question is leading us again, talking about the cultural context of apology and other things, and I would love to hear you talk about that.
Okay, brilliant. Oh, it's a fantastic question. Thanks very much, Colin. Your name, I don't know if I'm imagining your name is familiar to me, Colin, but thank you for the question. This is, there is something that comes across quite strongly in the literature, is that it's very sort of European American dominated. Okay, we read English and so on, but there is more and more work now. There is a project based in the Netherlands, I think it is, looking at this sort of cultural context of apologies. So a distinction is often made between America, between the United States and Japan, actually, because in the United States, which is traditionally seen as a much more litigious society, the argument goes you're less likely to see apologies generally, because people are afraid of being taken to court and so on. In Japan, less litigious society, but people, there's quite a issue around the delivery and performance of apologies. So there's some of you may have seen, sometimes you see these videos of very high-ranking business people making apologies and breaking down and resigning for errors. So there's a strong culture there of apologizing. There's a whole issue about social harmony, that it's a huge cultural faux pas to break the social harmony, and apology is part of sort of atoning for that. But that's just two cases. Well, in fact, in China, I read about that there's like 6 different interpretations or meanings, or 6 different types of apology you can give. I mean, it's a language issue as much as anything. But you're right that it's culturally specific for sure. Even a lot of people would say this about in Ireland, if somebody, or in Britain as well, actually, if somebody bumps into you, you say, oh, sorry. Whereas if you go to somewhere like the Netherlands, you don't get that. But the corollary of that is that in the Netherlands, giving an apology is a very serious thing. Whereas you might notice, certainly in Ireland, people say, oh, sorry about that. It just trips off the tongue. So that when somebody makes an apology, it's maybe not as big a deal. So there are different schools of thought around this. But absolutely internationally, imposing a Western idea of what's an appropriate apology on a non-Western culture, I imagine, is a very, very silly thing to do. Certainly in the Australian case with the Aboriginal people there, that apology was worked on for a long time to be delivered in a manner that was acceptable to the Aboriginal people of Australia. So that's hopefully give you some food for thought, but absolutely a growth area. And I can see the next question here.
Yeah, so I'll read the
Rose.
next one. This is a real historian's question, Rose Luminiello, who is at the University of Aberdeen. And Rose asked this, a question about the broader concept of apologies. This is a really good question too. Why is it, do you think, that people are more willing to accept apologies from secular actors rather than religious? In a sense, in a secular plural society, the state is the protector of civic virtue broadly conceived. So in theory, they should have the same responsibilities as a traditional religious moral authority. Is there a sense that this is because misconduct in religious institutions is more personal, takes place in a more vulnerable space, as opposed to a secular or state actor institution, whereas there is an individualized distance in most cases? So what do you think of that, Muiris?
Yeah, you've partially answered it, Rose. I think you're right that in the secular context, there is often mechanisms and institutions, okay, like the courts, but increasingly we see sort of avenues for addressing grievances like ombudsman offices or anti-corruption offices and so on. There are ways around it. That's not often the case, obviously, when you're dealing with religious institutions, where traditionally they're not at all designed to be sort of these kind of sort of accountability delivering bodies in the way we expect a state to be. It did come up in several of the interviews and focus groups, all right, about people finding it very difficult to get beyond sort of church abuses because you were dealing with spiritual and emotional and very, very personal, deeply felt beliefs and sets of relationships that they would have had with religious organizations. And there's also, there is actually a theology around apologies and forgiveness. It's not unique to Christianity, but certainly it's quite dominant in Christian thinking. We all know about the turn the other cheek idea. It's not about getting vengeance and compensation. It's about trying to love your enemy and so on. In the secular state context, though, it can often be different. It can be about compensation. It can be about retribution or reparations. Sorry, is the word I'm looking for. Reparations. But it's a great question. It's very difficult to answer these on the spot, I always find, but it's a very, very good point, Rose. No, it's a big picture sort of question about, there's, religion and politics, our status covers everything.
So we've had two good questions about more or less kind of the cultural, how apology to a certain extent is always culturally mediated. We have a different sort of question now from one of the dear friends at the Keough-Naughton Institute, Dan Carey, and Dan, who's in Galway, and Dan asked this: apropos of the summary of apologies, I wonder if you could comment on Queen Elizabeth's visit to Ireland in 2011. Some complained about the lack of formal apology for British atrocities in Ireland, but the visit went as far as it possibly could, short of an apology, in terms of the visit to the Garden of Remembrance and to Croke Park. My point is that diplomacy has different conventions about the circumstances in which apologies are made or not made.
Yeah, and you saw there's another question there from Gron. You saw Patrick. Yes. I'll come back to that in a second. But Daniel, you're absolutely right. I think, again, I wasn't really aware of this till I started into the literature on international relations and interstate apology. So there's two big sort of groupings of apologies. There's what's called interpersonal apologies. So there's the me to Patrick, Patrick to me, individual. But then there's the group ones. So normally state to state. And it's a very serious thing, like state apologies in international diplomacy for obvious reasons. You are massively into the area of compensation for past wrongs and so on. So I think you're right that the Queen sort of bowing at the Garden of Remembrance and saying things like, well, we all wish we could have done things differently. I'd say that was, for a first state visit by a British head of state stroke monarch, it was very significant. I think you're probably right. That was probably, bear in mind, actually, sorry, it absolutely relates to my previous point about, the Queen has an internal constituency she has to be careful for there as well. Imagine she comes along and apologises for all, I'm being a bit facetious here, and I'm saying sorry about 800 years of occupation or something like that. There's a whole it would cause great difficulty back at home, I imagine. So you're probably right. It was striking some sort of balance, as it were, there. But yeah, great point again. And
now we have one from Grania McAvoy, and she asks, what level of knowledge do you think your respondents had of avenues for seeking apology or redress? For example, the Commission for Victims and Survivors in Northern Ireland. Do you see any variation between respondents in the North and the South over how familiar they are with organizations, commissions, etc., that are established to support those owed an apology? Good question.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so there's it varied by case, of course. Obviously a lot of respondents in, say, Galway or West Cork weren't as familiar with the kind of the mechanisms that have been set up to deal with the Troubles. Equally, people in the North weren't very familiar with any of this, like the banking inquiry that had been set up in the South. So there was a little bit of that, but by and large, yeah, like in one sense, you're fortunate to be living in a sort of wealthy Western democracy where there is a concerted attempt by governments to provide avenues of reparation and redress. We all know there's countries around the world where it's just, terrible things have happened, and people have just had to accept it, and there's no hope ever of reparations or any sort of acknowledgement or truth commission or anything like this. But by and large, I mean, I would say, particularly for the focus groups, like we had to inform them in advance. Like any good student when conducting interviews, you have to do your ethics review, and part of that is making it clear to interviewees that you're fully aware of the dangers of re-traumatization, and if you feel this, that re-traumatization is an issue, we just want to draw your attention to the following avenues for redress, and by and large, people were aware of these. So that did come up a little bit. But yeah, as I say, there was some very, very unexpected findings in respect of, well, for me, I mean, when I went and interviewed, it was quite difficult to find victims of the banking crisis. And when I started to find out why, it was through an intermediary organization that was working with victims. And they said, look, you don't understand, like in many cases you have spouses, you have people whose spouse don't know that their house is in jeopardy, that they were so close to losing their house, like their husband or wife never told them, so they're certainly not going to be interviewed by you. They're certainly not going to take part in the focus group, their spouse doesn't know. Do you think their neighbors won't? So it was actually quite difficult, and I had to work through organizations that provide financial advice, and some solicitors who've been helping people out. But you did hear terrible stories of suicides and so on from people who just lost everything, because of the financial crisis. So yeah, that was some difficult events or meetings.
So we here at Keough-Naughton are an interdisciplinary institute, as you can tell from some of the questions, and we have another one coming from one of our anthropologists stroke archaeologists, and that's Ian Kite. And Ian is asking you a question really about cultural mediation and ritual, which is a fascinating one. It's a follow-up on Dan's question about the Queen's visit. And Ian asks, in some cases, it was the visual apology that was important. In the West, people noticed the green color of her dress and the use of Irish in her dress. And he's wondering if you could discuss that for a moment.
Yeah, that's right. Language and I just got a sign saying my internet connection was unstable. You're right. It is extraordinary how people remember these things. In fact, there's a very famous apology by this combined loyalist group in 1994, and it was the late Gusty Spence gave it, and he said, "I want to offer true and abject remorse." And it's extraordinary how many people remember that phrase, true and abject remorse. That came up quite a bit in our things as well. So what was said, but just on the, anthropologists would really have a field day with this kind of performative aspect of apologies. And I should have said the project is led by a colleague in Queen's, Muiris MacCarthaigh, and he works in what's known as transitional justice. So societies dealing with the conflict. And he told me once about a case with the FARC guerrillas in Colombia where, and I hope I'm probably putting a coach and four through this story, but if you'll just forgive me, you'll get the point. But there was a massacre committed in a village, and the organization responsible for that massacre, I honestly can't remember if it was FARC guerrillas or some other protagonists of that conflict, went back to that village and went on a stage, and they all wore white and sort of asked for forgiveness from that community for what had happened. So again, there's this kind of visual aspect of just the wearing the white and asking for, or delivering an apology, of course, and asking for forgiveness. So I think there's a lot more recognition now, and of course we live in that digital age, don't we, or that media age where people have to be seen. And from speaking to people in PR companies, it's a really big issue, as I said, about is it male, is it female, what do you wear, how do you speak? It wouldn't be good, would it, when you think about simple things like to be like smirking in the middle or smiling in the middle of an apology. You have to, in fact, there was a bit of a faux pas by somebody a few years back in Ireland that he was giving an apology, and he was sitting at a lectern made of clear perspex, and as he turned the sheet, just turning the sheet over, and the journalist sitting at the front could see what was written on the piece of paper, and it was like, "Don't smile," remember to say this, and it just in a way is sort of undermined what he was saying, because he'd clearly been sort of visibly schooled about how to say it and what to say. So again, that performative aspect, you have to be careful. I mean, it's not a very scientific thing to say, but there's it's very hard to escape from the fact that people do seem to smell authenticity in an apology, you know, that you can really tell when somebody's not being sincere or meaningful about it.
So
these are great questions. So Patrick, you did warn me.
No, I told you they'd be great. And so we have a question. Our own Mary Hendrickson asked a question about the role of media. She says these increasing number of apologies and their reach would not be possible without the media and its ability to amplify apology. So you said we're living in an age of accountability and apology. Is that come about because we are also living in a mediated age?
Yeah. We are, and I mean, a large part of the media is this accountability pursuit, isn't it? And we see it a lot, you know, where journalists, you know, Prime Minister or Mr. President, you know, are you going to apologize for like straight in with the big question? Are you going to apologize for this misdemeanor or this historical wrong? So yes, absolutely, the media play a big role. There's, in fact, there is this interesting debate about what are the relative merits of. I'm sure you maybe come across this before, that, you know, apologies for slavery, for example, and people say, well, you know, the people who were the slave owners should apologize, and they're all dead. Like, what good is this apology in the modern age, and so on. In fact, slavery comes up a lot. The city of Amsterdam apologized, I think it's 2 years ago. The city authorities apologized for its role in the slave trade, but the Dutch government had a real dilemma over it, and it didn't issue. It just said it regretted it, but it didn't issue a formal apology. So there's these historical apologies bring up a lot of that question about who should, like, is a historical apology worth doing, you know, like, what's the point? Like, it's in the past almost. But the media managed to keep a lot of these things alive and keep them bubbling, and often for the sort of descendants and families of people who were historically wronged, it's of course a huge thing, particularly people seeking like pardon. You know, if people were maybe executed for something 100 years ago, that they would get an official pardon or something like this. So, good question, Mary. Yes, the media do very much.
I'm going to invoke the chair's prerogative and ask the last question. Let me pose this to you here. And so you've told us, you know, again, the age of apology, the age of accountability, apology mania. Are we distinctive today? Is this something that is kind of really says a great deal about us? Are we different from those people who have come before? And if that's the case, how would you kind of could you tell us why you think that's the case?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, let me just think historically, but I do think there's something to be said for the pursuit of apologies has probably never been as big as it is today. There is that sense of people are entitled to, when you think about human history, I guess, you know, this belief that, you know, bad things happened and that was it. And today we live in an age, well, a bad thing happened to me, but my goodness, I'm going to get compensated for that, or I am going to. There are ways and means, like this belief. I think that it is the role of government, of modern governments. Their role is to provide redress, is to provide mechanisms for restoring that harmony and so on. And it kind of relates. I've been involved in a completely separate project looking at the emergence of agencies, we call it, but arm's length bodies in public administration. And we did this across 22 states in Europe, and a large number of them are like ombudsman's offices, grievance handling organizations. So people think, well, I want an ombudsman for pensioners. I want an ombudsman for the insurance sector. I want a means. I want the state to provide me with a mechanism and a means to deal with my problem, whatever that is. And I'm going to push for that. And of course, governments will want to deliver what people want all the time. It's the tragedy of the commons. But I think culturally, yeah, there is this sense of as I mentioned, litigiousness and belief in compensation and reparation and wanting wrongs to be righted. You might be in a better position, Patrick, to answer that. I mean, as a top class historian, you know, I wonder, I don't want to overplay it. I wonder, there's a parallel problem though. Of course, the more apologies you have, they lose meaning. So was state apology 50 years ago? Was it maybe a big, like Willy Brandt's knee fall? Could that be done today? Would it be seen as, oh, that's just posturing? You know, it was generally seen as authentic. Apparently, nobody expected it, which again made it very authentic. His advisor, I mean, this was the Cold War times, a very, very sensitive thing. And he just did that kneeling down for a minute and said nothing. And it's remembered as one of the world's most famous apologies. Would it be the same today? I don't know. Maybe not. Another good question. You see what I mean? This will just keep, I think we
Well,
can
it
keep
keeps
going.
going. I mean, we could stay here another hour talking about this, and it's clear that you kind of you touched off a robust conversation, and it set off also an extraordinary set of questions, and it testifies to the fact of what a wonderful talk it was. And so thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for doing this. And I really do look forward to finally get you over here properly, so that we can enjoy our time together here at Notre Dame. But before that, I look forward to seeing you in Ireland. But I can't thank you enough for joining us, Muiris, for a wonderful conversation.
Oh, not at all. Don't be. No, a complete pleasure. And thank you everybody for tuning in and giving up your time and the questions especially. So, and yeah, take care of yourselves in these Corona pandemic times. I hope everybody's getting vaccinated soon. So thanks. Enjoy the rest of the day.
And you too. Thanks, Muiris, and thank you to the audience.